Alright, what we have here is a Dodge USAF 500, 600 series taper bearings that go in the split housing saddles. I'm just going to show you how it's assembled before we put it on the shaft, so it's done right. If the bearing turns like this, it's just the rollers are lopsided a little bit. You just have to push them back in to straighten it out. It's tapered, so it goes on one way. Put it on the wrong way, it won't fit. Put it on the right way, it will go down far enough. You have a lock tab washer, goes on first, tapers out. The lock retaining nut, spanner nut, is tapered as well. The taper goes towards the lock ring. Spin it on, but do not tighten. You want the bearing to float. And we're ready for install. This table 1 will be available on our website. You'll have to reference this later on during install for proper tightening tolerances. Table 1 will give you a list of the different shaft sizes, and then in the next column it gives you all the reduction in internal clearances in inches that we want to achieve, and that's where when we tighten our bearings, we'll be referencing this table, and you'll see that we'll go down from, let's say, just like 10 thousandths of an inch in internal clearance down to, for a 2 7/16 shaft, a reduction of 1.5 to 2 thousandths. So if we start at 10,000, we'll go down to 8,000. You want to make sure that your drum is offset to the non-drive side, because when we tighten the drive side taper bearing first, it's going to pull this drum about 1/8 of an inch, maybe not that much, but it should be somewhere around 1/8 of an inch this way. So we'll offset it so that when it does that, it'll be centered in the base. We've got the bearings installed on the shaft on both sides. The drum's down in here. You notice we got a seal ring on both sides that fit down in the 2 grooves that are on the pillow block. Make sure they're centered in there and they float freely. Our bearing itself is also pushed all the way back in the expansion slot that's milled into this bearing. You want it all the way back so that when you tighten the spanner nut, that's what's going to pull this drum this way and keep the bearing seated where it is. The bearing will also be pushed all the way to the outer slot on the other side, which you'll see in a minute. That will allow it to pull back this way and not bind up when we tighten this side, so that it doesn't restrict the bearing from tightening or put anything in a bind while we're doing this. The non-drive side bearing, as stated before, you'll see that it's all the way to the outer slot away from the drum, so that when we tighten the other side and it pulls the drum, it has a place to go in the expansion slot. Alright, first thing we want to do is get a roller to 12 noon top dead center on the bearing race, and we're gonna, before we start tightening, we're going to check our internal clearance. We need to know what it is before we start, because we'll have to reference our table 1 on our website or the material that comes with the bearing to know what we're supposed to reduce it by for internal clearance to tighten this. So I have 5 thousandths fits, 6 thousandths does not. So 5 thousandths is where we're starting from, and according to table 1, we have to reduce it by 1 to 2 thousandths, or 1.5 to 2 thousandths. So we're going to go, in this case, down to 3 thousandths. We want 3 thousandths to not clear. That'll give us 2 thousandths. When you're assembling the bearing, it's not required, but it's something that I do, and I usually will put a coat of anti-seize on the threads and this lock ring. It just kind of reduces the frictions and makes it easier to tighten, but it's not required. It comes with a thin film of oil on it, so it is lubed, but not required. One thing to make sure you don't do is put any oil on the shaft, because that's strictly frictional forces that are holding this taper adapter to the shaft and keeping this thing from sliding in the bearing itself. So with that, we're going to go ahead and start tightening. There's several ways to do this. I always like to give the drum a roll and just hold my punch in there and let the drum tighten it up for me until I see the adapter spinning, and then we'll start tightening. You can use a cold steel chisel like this, available at any of the major hardware home improvement stores. I like these because they got a little hand protector, so if you miss, it's not a trip to the emergency room. And then you just pound on it while you're rolling it. And then spin it. After you pound it on it for a little while, that'll let these rollers kind of get seated and move around a little bit so they're not bound up. And you want to check your tolerances. Again, I got the 3/1000 of an inch shim or feeler gauge that I want to check on top dead center, 12 noon, between the inside of the outer race and the top of a roller to check for this clearance. You don't want to go a whole bunch because you don't know how far to go, so you just want to do a little bit, check it, a little bit, check it until you get there. But it's always a good idea to roll the drum so that you relieve any tension or binding that might occur. I'm going to check it in a different spot. And it feels like I'm pretty well there. Doesn't look like I went very far, but I rolled it quite a bit already with just rolling it against the chisel. And then I'm using a 3-pound small handheld sledge to tighten this. Now it went through there, so I'm going to go just a little bit more just to make sure that I'm right. Check it in another spot. Don't stick your feeler gauge in there and roll the drum because it will cause imperfections and ruin your feeler gauge. Okay, stop it at top dead center, and we're pretty well good. So now we need to proceed to the next step, and that is finding a slot in this spanner nut that lines up with one of these tabs. We need to bend one down in. This one is really close. You want to always go ahead and never back up. We're going to go just a little bit more. And we're going to pound one down in there. Next step is we got to pack this bearing with grease. There's a couple different ways to do it. One is to manually do it, and basically it's just like packing a wheel bearing for a car. You just cup it in your hand, get a little bit on your fingers, and you're going to push through and roll the drum while you're doing that, and you just want to see it protrude through. You're just going to make a couple revolutions like that and until you get a nice good coat squeezing out all the way around it. The other way is if you have a needle for a grease gun, in this case an air grease gun, you can locate the holes that are for the grease in the cap. You just stick your needle in one of the holes and grease it while you're spinning it, and it's just like greasing it through the cap. going to put some grease down in around the bearing as well, more or less filling the lower cavity. And then we're going to apply some to these seals so that we keep dust and debris out. And then we're going to put some right on top of the bearing. And our last step is that we have this expansion groove that's milled into the pillow block. It's also into the cap part too. They give you what's called a spacer ring or take-up ring, expansion ring, whichever has several names. This needs to go into the controlled side, which we want to be our drive side, because our driven shev is mounted right here when we're all done. And we want this side not to move, and the other side will be our expansion side, which will, in the event that it heats up, will allow it to expand and contract and not put a side load on these bearings. And we'll show you that in a little bit. You just lightly tap this down into this groove, and you can roll it around, usually by your fingers, but sometimes you got to tunk it around. And you set it up horseshoe facing up, and you apply the top cap. The top caps are mated. You're going to see usually the hole will be offset for the dowel pin, but if it's not and you can't tell, they usually have a stamping, a series of dashes or alphanumerical or whatever it be. You mate those up and you set the cap on, and you're done. Tighten the bolts and you're ready to go. Now we'll move to the other side. We're going to start on the non-drive side. First checking internal clearance between the inner part of the outer race of the bearing and the top upmost roller. I can get a 6/1000 of an inch feeler gauge through. And according to our table that we spoke of earlier, we need a 1.5 to 2/1000 reduction, so we'll go down till we can get a 4 to not fit, so 4/1000 should not fit. Also note that our bearing is still towards the outer part of the expansion slot, which we need that because when we tighten this spanner nut now, it's going to push this bearing up the tapered shaft, and we need it to not be against the inner groove or any groove, so that we're allowed to float back and forth in between here with expansion. If we don't have that, we'll put a preload on the sides of the bearings and they'll fail prematurely. We're going to start by rolling the drum. I like to do this little trick. Just kind of saves time up the taper locks moving. Just kind of let it keep sitting in. Taper lock sliding there again. Just keep rolling it till we get it tightened up. It just saves you from a lot of hammer time. It's getting pretty stiff there, so we're pretty tight already. So now we're going to start by using our cold steel chisel again and driving down. One thing I will point out right now is that you don't want to have your chisel in too far that you make contact with the lock ring, because you will bend or break off the tab that's tabbed into the timed with the groove in here, and it essentially will not do its job. So just pay attention to that, and you don't have that happen. Give it a roll, and we're gonna go ahead and check it. Now again, it doesn't seem like I'm tightening it that much because I've already taken a lot of it out just rolling the drum against my cold chisel. So I'm going to stop it right there. We got one at top dead center. I've got my 4/1000 feeler gauge. and we're going to check it in a couple spots. Just got to make sure that we don't just have something bound up. A little bit more. I think we're pretty well right there. Oh, we're gonna go through that one. We're gonna go just a little bit more. Okay, give it a roll. Give it a roll again. Let everything kind of find its seat. Tapping just to make sure nothing's not sitting flat. Stop it right there. And I think we're going to be pretty good. Check in a couple spots just to make sure you don't have something different. And we're good. So we're going to find a lock tab again that's either lined up or close to one of these lock rings. That one's close. That one's past it. Again, don't back up. Always go forward to line one up. You don't want a chance loosening this bearing up. It'll slide on the shaft. Alright, we're gonna, just like the other side, start purging this bearing. We're doing it the lazy way. You don't have all the fancy tools, the old-fashioned way will work just fine. Alright, and before we go too much farther, you'll notice that our bearing is located pretty close to the middle of our expansion groove, so we're good. We have room to expand one way or another here, so we're not putting any preload on the side. I'm going to go ahead and apply a little grease to these seals so that they keep debris out. Just a little on there will work itself around. And then I'm going to put a little on the bottom of the housing. Once this is all done, you do not have to grease it after everything's assembled, such as the cap being put on. It has all the grease it will need for quite some time. When you go to tighten the bearing cap, it's a good idea to give the drum a roll while you're tightening the two threaded bolts into the bearing cap, because if your bearing itself is crooked, when you tighten them while you're rolling this drum, if the drum comes to an abrupt halt, that means your bearing is crooked and you're putting excessive radial load on the bearing and you'll cause failure. The only way you would ever know that is if you spun it and you could see that it stopped ways. Instead, it should just keep kind of free rolling like that. So just to keep that in mind, it does happen from time to time, not always, but it can happen.